It sounds like something out of a movie, right? What if the United States just decided to go and arrest the leader of another country? Well, it's not a hypothetical anymore. We're about to walk you through the absolutely unprecedented U.S. operation in Venezuela that ended with a sitting president in American custody.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture this, it's January 3rd, 2026. News breaks that sends absolute shockwaves across the globe. United States Special Forces have just conducted a raid in Caracas, and they've taken Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro into custody, just like that.
So you're probably wondering, how on earth does something like this even happen? Let's get right into the nuts and bolts of the raid itself.
Now, this was not some long, drawn-out conflict. We are talking about a lightning-fast surgical strike. After months of planning, you have this massive force, over 150 U.S. military aircraft, slipping into Venezuelan airspace late on a Friday night. By the time most of the world was waking up, the president of Venezuela was already on a U.S. plane. The whole operation was completed in just over an hour. From a U.S. military perspective, the operation went off without a hitch. 0 American casualties. But the picture on the ground in Caracas, that's a completely different story. Venezuela's interior minister reported that 100 people were killed, a figure that might even include Cuban personnel who were allied with the Maduro government.
And that, of course, brings us to the biggest question of all. Why? What possible reasons could the White House give for taking such a drastic and historic action against a sovereign nation?
So the official story from the administration has a few different layers. The number one reason they gave was to dismantle a so-called narco-terrorism conspiracy that they claimed Maduro was leading. But they also cited other reasons, from stopping Venezuela from hosting foreign adversaries to preventing it from acquiring dangerous weapons. When you look at the whole picture, though, the underlying objectives seem pretty clear: force a regime change and gain some influence over the nation's massive oil industry.
In fact, the president himself described Venezuela's oil industry as a total bust. That quote right there really tells you just how central the economic and resource angle was to the public reasoning. But to really understand why the oil industry was in such bad shape, we've got to rewind a bit.
See, this raid on January 3rd didn't just happen in a vacuum. Not at all. It was really the final chapter of a story that's been building for more than a decade. A story of escalating economic pressure, primarily through sanctions.
It all started back in 2015 with some targeted sanctions, but then the pressure really started to ramp up. In 2017, the sanctions hit where it hurt the most, the country's lifeblood, its state-owned oil company. Then, in 2019, a full-on oil embargo basically cut Venezuela off from key markets. By 2025, this whole economic pressure campaign started to get military, with strikes on supposed drug boats and even the seizure of an oil tanker. That really set the stage for what was to come.
And the effect of all that pressure? Absolutely devastating. And here's the crazy part. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves. But between years of mismanagement and these crippling sanctions, its production completely collapsed. By the late 2020s, oil output had plummeted by nearly 80% from its peak just over a decade earlier. Think about that. Now, critics of this policy, like Mark Weisbrot, argued these sanctions went way beyond just targeting the government. They contend that by choking off the country's main source of revenue, the sanctions became a form of economic violence that punished ordinary Venezuelans. One study even estimated that the economic fallout led to an additional 40,000 deaths as the country struggled to import basic necessities like food and medicine, a truly staggering human cost.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the huge legal storm this has created back home in the United States. It sparked this fierce debate about the limits of presidential power.
And it all boils down to this one fundamental question now being argued in Congress and the courts. Did the president actually have the authority to order this kind of military action without a formal declaration of war?
So the administration's entire legal justification, it all hinges on this one very specific phrase: non-international armed conflict. By framing this as a fight against drug cartels and not a war against the nation of Venezuela, the White House claims it was acting within its authority to defend the U.S. against designated terrorist organizations.
And this gets to a really old argument, a tension that's literally written into the U.S. Constitution. You see, Article 1 gives Congress the power to declare war, but Article 2 makes the president the commander-in-chief. This operation in Venezuela just threw that inherent conflict into the spotlight like never before.
As a result, you've got a ton of legal scholars and a bipartisan group of lawmakers pushing back, and pushing back hard.
They argue the intervention was an unconstitutional act of war, and that an operation to overthrow a foreign government requires explicit authorization from Congress. This has kicked off all new calls to limit the president's war-making powers.
So, with President Maduro now in U.S. custody and facing charges, the entire future of Venezuela is just hanging in the balance.
Well, in the immediate aftermath, Maduro pleaded not guilty in a New York court. Back in Caracas, his vice president was sworn in as the interim leader, and here's the twist, with public backing from the U.S. administration. But make no mistake, the U.S. has made it very clear it intends to oversee the country's transition, sidestepping established opposition leaders in the process. And the economic plan here is, wow, it's incredibly ambitious. The White House is pushing for American oil companies to invest a staggering $100 billion to resurrect Venezuela's crumbling oil infrastructure. And the U.S. government says it's going to deal directly with these companies, not the new Venezuelan leadership.
But the oil industry itself is totally split on this. You have a company like Chevron, which kind of maintained a foothold there, and they're ready to ramp up production. But then you have others, like the CEO of ExxonMobil, who are deeply wary, calling the country uninvestable without some serious security guarantees. It's just a stark reminder of the immense risk involved.
And zooming out from Venezuela, this intervention has set a really controversial new precedent on the world stage. A United Nations spokesperson warned that forcibly removing a foreign leader makes all nations less secure. It raises this very real fear that it could legitimize similar actions by other global powers.
And that leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? Is this the beginning of a new, more aggressive era of American foreign policy, or was it a necessary evil to avert a larger crisis? There are no easy answers here. For now, the world is watching to see what happens next.